Patrolling a posh area, a prejudiced police officer notices a black guy on a stroll. He believes the man must be up to no good and arrests him for no apparent reason later on. The officer is told he nabbed a Michael Adams, a high-ranking general in the United States Army general, walked softly on the sidewalk along one of these tree-lined streets. Michael was tall and powerful. Michael had been in this area, and his athletic frame suggested his years of military duty despite his casual demeanor there. Authority about him was something in his stance and the way he held himself. Many times before, not everyone knew he possessed a property only a few streets away, one he had bought years ago as a quiet retreat from the pressures of his profession. This was where he came to relax and escape. The demands of his duties today, he chose to stroll because he usually enjoyed the late afternoon light and the peace of the streets. The sun sank lower C in larger shadows, and Michael kept walking uninformed of the occurrences. Officer James Davis changed his normal routine for now. He was just another person enjoying the simplicity of a late summer afternoon, finding serenity in the daily events that life had to give. This tranquil pattern would soon be broken. His eyes scanned the area like a hawk hunting prey. His police vehicle moved along at a crawl, the motor humming gently. The rearview mirror showed him driving slowly down the street. Davis felt great satisfaction in his profession, as he knew he was the line of protection against anything that would disrupt the peace and order in the streets of this rich suburb. He had done many times before, guaranteeing their safety. Davis's palm lay on the steering wheel, fingers tapping absent-mindedly to a melody he could hardly hear over the vehicle. The familiar sights passed by the calm village, almost too quiet. Everything appeared regular until he saw a black guy strolling alone down the street, nonchalant. Children's bicycles hanging against fences, gardeners cutting hedges, and the odd runner or dog walker's glances seemed normal until he was tall, strong, wearing a basic white t-shirt and trousers. His stride was leisurely, and he didn't seem to be in any rush. There was nothing especially terrifying about him. His eyes, as he took in his look. Something about the sight sent off bells in Davis's head. He didn't know the guy, and that alone was enough to make him suspicious. "Who are you?" Davis said under his breath as he maintained his eyes on the man. "What are you doing here?" Davis had lived on the forest for 10 years, long enough to rely on his senses. They told him something was odd in an upscale, mostly white area, in Davis's experience. Anybody who didn't fit would have found this. Davis slowed the vehicle even further, maintaining pace with the man's stroll. The normal pattern was frequently up to no good either way. The guy was disoriented or maybe looking out homes. Davis was not going to simply go by without finding out more. Davis's jaw clenched. That peacefulness infuriated him. As he passed, he noticed the guy glance over at the vehicle. His demeanor was serene and indifferent. It seemed as if he didn't care about his presence at all. Davis didn't. Like he did, he made a snap choice to pull his police vehicle over to park. He stepped out, tightening his belt, and the radio strapped to his shoulder. The guy kept walking, seeming unconcerned of the officers. Approach. Davis felt a flutter of irritation. He raised his voice as he walked near the guy. He yelled out, halted, and turned to face Davis. He stared squarely at him, his eyes steady and uncompromising. "Yeah, officer." When he asked Davis not right away, he paused to examine the guy up close. His posture was serene, as if he didn't regard Davis as a danger. It just heightened Davis's mistrust. "What are you doing here?" Davis questioned, his tone harsh. "Simply walking." The guy responded evenly. "Is that not allowed?" Davis scowled. He did not like the man's tone, so calm and unbothered it made him. Davis enjoyed being in charge. He took a step closer, squaring his shoulders. "I'm going to need to see some ID." The guy cocked an eyebrow, but his voice carried authority. He felt he wasn't in control of the situation. Didn't move. "Why am I being accused of anything?" Davis's patience was running thin. "This is a private area. We don't typically see people like you around here." I have the right to question anybody who appears out of place, the man side-sided. Gently, and Davis's irritation rose. I live close, the guy replied, just a few streets away. I'm not doing anything illegal, officer. I'm merely taking a stroll. Show me some IDE. Davis repeated his hand. Not in the mood for resistance the training had taught him. Instead, he moved automatically for his belt, where his radio and other weapons of power hung. Control was vital under these circumstances. The guy reached into his pocket gently and gradually pulled out his wallet and put it out, giving Davis his identity. Davis grabbed it, looked at the name, and eyes flared with astonishment for a short time. The address was certainly a local one, yet something still didn't set right with him. Maybe it was the man's cool manner, or maybe simply Davis's own sense of duty kicking in. I've never seen you around here before, Davis remarked, his tone still strong. How long have you? Been here many years, the guy said. I'm not out much, generally working. Not sure why this is required. Davis felt the heat rising in his cheeks. He didn't appreciate being questioned, particularly not by someone who appeared to believe they were. Above suspicion, his grasp tightened on his ID, required or not. I have to make sure everything is in order. Davis snapped reports of suspicious behavior in the vicinity. The guy remained mute. Eyes remained fixed on Davis. Davis detested that he was the only one in command here, not some stranger who felt he could stroll anywhere he wanted. He had to demonstrate his power. His face lacked fear. His pulse was racing a bit quicker now. A combination of aggravation and something else he didn't want to acknowledge was uncertainty. While he stayed right here, Davis instructed, "Don't move." He turned, walking back to run the concept. Davis took another look at the guy, silently weighted the disquiet in his chest. Something about this entire circumstance didn't seem right, but he put the idea aside. He was. Davis sat in his police cruiser, eyes on the guy via the rearview mirror as he began typing the man's data. He was an officer of the law, and it was his responsibility to keep this area secure. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Michael waited on the pavement, observing as Officer Davis returned to his police vehicle. He felt the weight of the officer inspection even from within the system, a sensation of anxiety hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. The street remained the serenity, broken only by the faint tweeting of birds and the hum of Davis's police cruiser. Michael maintained his breathing constant, keeping his calm exterior. He knew he had nothing to conceal. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the way Davis treated him, the inquiries and demand for his IDE, all made his muscles stiff. Michael's thoughts repeated, the exchange. The officers demand that. Michael seemed out of place, the way his hand hung near his belt, as if ready for anything Michael knew. He had seen this many times throughout his service, a combination of suspicion and authority aimed against individuals deemed unusual or out of place seemed like something far worse if not handled wisely. Michael looked around. A few people were observing from a distance now. A middle-aged guy with a garden hose in hand gazed directly, water flowing over the pavement. A lady walking her dog had stopped her phone. Peering through windows or standing in their yards, interested about what was occurring. Davis was still in his vehicle, out as if ready to record. Michael caught her eyes quickly, and she turned away. He took a long, deep breath. This was the last thing he had wanted, a scene, a confrontation Davis had wanted. Michael knew the officer was running his ID, checking his records, attempting to find anything to explain this stop Michael had seen before the fishing, for reasons when there were none to start. He was pounding away at his computer. It didn't set well with him, but he also understood that responding with wrath would not assist patience. He told himself, let it play out. Davis came from the police cruiser, the ID still in his hand. His face was a mask of aggravation. He walked back. Seems as if he was dissatisfied, but it doesn't explain why you're here. Across to Michael, halting just a foot away, standing a little straighter, attempting to impose control. Your record's spotless, Michael said coolly. I reside here, and Davis's brows sharpened. I told you we have received complaints of strange behavior. It's mine. Job to check things out. Michael maintained his eyes steady. I realize that, officer, but I'm not creating any issue. I'm just walking Davis. Aggravation was clearly seen now. His cheeks reddened slightly a scowl. Michael could see the faint edge growing into the officer's brow as he creased his forehead and looked about at the little crowd they had drawn. He disliked being challenged, particularly in front of others. Now look, Davis said, his voice dropping. We can do this the simple way or the hard way. You tell me precisely what you're doing here, or I take you in for further questioning. It's up. Michael felt a flutter of wrath but controlled it. He recognized this strategy of intimidation until the other person crumbled. I have told you all you need to know, Michael said calmly. You're making a mistake. Davis's jaw clenched. The only error I see is someone believing they can stroll around this area without being questioned now. Should I escalate this? Michael's tolerance was running thin. He had tried to reason, try to explain, but Davis wasn't listening. This wasn't about safety. It was about control over someone he thought to be a danger based only on. Michael looked to the people observing, then back at Davis. Officer, I'm not resisting, Michael stated, keeping his voice calm. But I also know my rights. You have no reasons to arrest me. Davis's eyes blazed. Angry. I'll choose what's right and wrong. He snapped without warning, reached out, seizing Michael by the arm. You're carrying, stiffened as Davis's hold tightened, easily overpowering the training kicking in. Officer, but he knew that would just aggravate the matter. He allowed Davis drag him toward the police vehicle, feeling the roughness of the cuffs being snapped around his wrists. This truly essential, Michael inquired, his voice calm. But strict Davis disregarded him, dragging Michael toward the rear of the vehicle. Get in, he screamed. Michael obliged, seating down in the back seat. His hands tied behind him, he gazed out at the gathering bystanders. Their looks Michael hoped it would be sufficient to avoid things from going worse as Davis slammed the door shut. The lady with the dog had mixed bewilderment and worry. Michael felt a rush of anger wash over him. He had gone out for a calm stroll, something to clear his thoughts, and here he was seated in the rear of a police cruiser, treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. And Davis radioing, and his voice strained as he told the station. Michael slumped back in the car, took another long breath. He knew this wasn't done yet, and as much as this implied, he wanted to strike back, but he realized he had to remain cool to maintain his composure, as this was about something much more than just him. It was about something he had dealt with his whole life, and now seated in the back of a patrol. Michael sat in the rear of the patrol vehicle, his wrist still. The struggle for respect and equality was far from over. The journey to the police station. His hands shackled, Michael reminded him. Restricted by the cold metal of the shackles he retained, he kept his eyes ahead, ignoring the odd look Officer Davis shot at him via the rearview mirror. The landscape, distorted by the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, changed to the... Michael's thoughts was racing, not with terror, but with a feeling of incredulity at how quickly a basic stroll had become. This Davis drove into the station, parking the car in a lot loaded with police cars. He jumped out, pulling open the rear door, and grabbing by the arm. The station was humming with activity. Policemen rushing in and out, chatting on radios, carrying files as Davis led Michael inside a few feet. Davis ignored them, taking Michael down the corridor into the holding area. Michael felt the eyes of the other cops on him, heard the murmur of whispers. It wasn't the interest sparking in their eyes. First time he had been under investigation, but this was the first time it had occurred on the other side of the law. He had pledged to defend Michael, had spent his life preserving order, protecting his nation, and now he was being paraded through a police station like a normal criminal. Davis pushed open a door leading Michael into a standard holding room. Bare walls, a table, and 2 seats. Davis signaled for Michael to sit. Michael obeyed. Davis stood by the door, arms crossed, a self-satisfied expression on his face. "You will remain here till we get this straightened out." Davis stated his tone, abrupt. Michael met his stare squarely. "What?" "Precisely are we sorting out, officer. You have IDE. You know where I live. What more do you need?" Davis's eyes sharpened. "I need to know why you were in that area. Why you felt you could simply stroll around like you owned the place." Michael groaned, his annoyance under the surface. "I wasn't doing anything illegal. I live in that area, and I have done nothing to warrant this punishment." Davis's face flushed. "Folks like you do not simply stroll." Michael's eyes widened. "Individuals like me." And he repeated, "Precisely what exactly do you mean?" "Around communities like that," he hissed, "you might have been casing homes searching for an opportunity." Officer Davis's jaw clenched, but Michael sensed Davis's fury, his desire to impose authority to show a point. He understood this was not about him personally, but more about the room falling into an uncomfortable stillness, the tension heavy in the air. Michael recognized. What he stood for to Davis was a disturbance of the order he was so anxious to preserve. Sergeant Laura Smith entered and was a tall lady with short brown hair, projecting professionalism. Mingled with worry, she looked at Davis, then at Michael's eyes. Evaluating the circumstances, Michael identified her type. Calm, composed, a voice of reason in the thick of mayhem. "What is going on here?" Sergeant Smith inquired. Her voice calm. Davis straightened, noticed him strolling in the posh area, behaving suspicious. He refused to explain himself, so I took him in. Smith stared at Michael, her eyes harsh but fair as that. True. Michael nodded slightly. "I was walking. Officer Davis asked me, and I showed my ID, explained that I live close. That wasn't enough for him." Smith went to Davis. "And did you run his ID?" "Yes," Davis said swiftly. "It returned. Returned clean, but you still brought him in." "Smith," interjected, her tone hard. "On what grounds?" Davis paused, plainly uncomfortable under Smith's inspection. He was behaving suspiciously. "I was doing my job, keeping the neighborhood safe." Smith sighed, crossing her arms. "This guy is a high-ranking general in the United States Army," she said softly but clearly. "You have brought him in, without reason, in handcuffs. Little less do you know the consequences of this." "I didn't know," he stuttered. Smith's eyes narrowed. "It shouldn't matter who he is. Your mission is to protect and serve, not to judge based on looks." Davis blinked, apparently taken aback, then back at Smith. Michael's wrists were released, and he gently touched them, feeling the discomfort from the strong hold of the metal. He dropped instantly. Davis struggled with the keys, going forward to unlock the cuffs. Stood tall above Davis, but maintained his cool. Sergeant Smith. Michael added, "Thank you for your professionalism. This is not only about me, but also about how people like Officer Davis approach their duty." Nodded. "I agree. We will talk more. General Adams, rest assured this event will be handled responsibly." Michael glanced at Davis, who still looked shocked. "I hope this is a wake-up call," Michael stated softly. "Dangerous ones." Smith nodded toward the door. "Let's take this to my office," she said. "We need to handle what occurred here today." As they exited the holding room, Michael went beside. Someone by their look might lead to blunders. Smith knew this wasn't over when he felt the other cops staring at him. However, if this was the catalyst, then so be it. Back in Smith's office, Michael sat and started the necessary discussions for reforms. Michael watched her through the glass window, thinking about the long road ahead. It wasn't just about. Across from her, Davis was left standing outside, his face a combination of perplexity and shame. Michael had spent his entire battling this. One officer's acts related to the culture that enabled those actions to occur in the first place. Michael wanted to see it through the struggle for respect for. Equality stretched to every street, every neighborhood, and every contact. Smith laid down her pen, looking up. "Michael, I'm sorry for what occurred," she said. "We'll make sure this doesn't go. It didn't end on the battlefield." Michael nodded silently. "It's not about apologies, Sergeant. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anybody else." Smith nodded in agreement. "We'll start with Officer Davis, and then we'll look." Though it takes time, by the end, the little office of Sergeant Laura Smith was filled with a tense stillness. Michael sat across from her, hands resting on his knees, his face serene. Yet alert, Sergeant Smith had just completed compiling notes from Michael's version of the event. Her pen rested on the desk forgotten as she thought what to do next. Outside, the murmur of the station's operations continued, but in here the tension was almost tangible. Smith inhaled deeply, breaking the stillness. "General Adams," she said, "I want to let you know that what occurred today is not how we run. Officer Davis's activities were out of line. This kind of conduct is not it here." Michael nodded slightly with a neutral look. "I appreciate, Sergeant, but I have seen too much of this kind of behavior. It is not about one officer. It is about the attitude that lets this continue." Smith's eyes flicked with knowledge. She had been in law enforcement long enough to know Michael was correct. It was not just about one event, but rather about the deeper one. Concerns that required addressed. She had joined the police to make a difference, to follow the law equally, and events like these made her realize how far they still had to go. General Adam Smith added cautiously, "If you're willing, I would want to hear more about your viewpoint on this, your experience both now and your career. It might help us understand how to avoid this from occurring again." Michael moved forward, his eyes meeting Smith's. "Sergeant, I have spent my life in service. I've led soldiers, made judgments in warfare, dealt with crises of all types, and I've encountered prejudice. Silent and not so quiet. Today was different. Treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than strolling in my own neighborhood. I have fought for this country, and yet I am considered as a danger because of my appearance." Smith listened, her face serious. "We are here to protect everyone, General, yet you are correct." Michael agreed. "It's not just about punishing Davis. Sometimes our own prejudices cloud our judgment. Davis has been a competent cop, but this isn't the first time I have heard issues with his conduct. Every officer knows that their responsibility is to defend, not to criticize this form of racial profiling. It is hazardous and results in distrust. When the society loses faith in its police, we have failed." Smith glanced down at her notes. She understood not everyone shared the attitude we would be using, but she had always taken great satisfaction in treating people with respect. Smith said Davis would be suspended until the result, but more than that, we should investigate how we equip our officials to interact with the community Michael valued. Michael loved her sincerity. She was not only stating the correct things, she was devoted to actual change, education, and training is a start, Michael said. But it's also about accountability. Officials must realize that acts like these affect the whole community. Smith nodded, rather than just the one being profiled. "First, we will hold Davis responsible. Second, we will go ahead looking over our training courses. We must establish confidence, not just by enforcing laws, but also by then." The door to Smith's office opened, and Officer Davis stood. Looking reluctant, Smith waved for him to enter. Davis, his eyes darted between Smith and Michael. "Officer Davis," Smith started, her tone measured. "General Adams has described his side of what occurred today. We have run his history. As you now know," Davis moved uncomfortable, the color increasing. "You are a high-ranking officer in the United States Army, so your actions were unprofessional and unacceptable." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Your duty is to guard and serve everyone in this town, not. I thought I was simply doing my job." "I didn't realize he was a general," Davis stated, his voice defensive. Davis opened his lips as if to protest, but then closed it. "You made presumptions based on looks, brought in a guy without reason, treated him like a suspect, and violated his rights. That is not performing your job." Once again, he looked at Michael, then back at Smith. "I was simply trying to keep the neighborhood safe," Davis stated softly. Michael stood up, facing officer safety. isn't about targeting people who appear different. It's about, I was out for a stroll, that's all. And yet you made me feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood. That's not keeping anybody safe. Davis's shoulder. Justice treating everyone with respect. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't want for it to go this way. Michael observed him. The sincerity in Davis's apology seemed more out of fear than knowing this isn't just about slumped slightly. Michael apologized. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone. Smith stood up, her stance firm. Officer Davis, you're suspended effective immediately. There will be an inquiry into your behavior and, depending on the result, Davis nodded, looking disheartened. He turned and left the office without additional comment. The door closed softly behind him. Smith watched him leave, then turned back. Michael Weck performs better, she replied. I'll make sure of it. Michael nodded. I trust you, Sergeant, but remember, this isn't just about Davis. It's about altering the culture that allows this sort of conduct to occur, starting with. General, I know it hasn't been easy, but your comments will make a difference. Michael took a long breath, realizing the leadership begins with officers like you. Smith sat back down, looking thoughtful. Thank you for your patience today. Sergeant, let's make sure we play it properly. He rose up, extended his hand. Smith shook it firmly, a quiet accord flowing between them. The weight of the day starts to lift somewhat. Michael went out into the sunshine with a sense of purpose. This event, it wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. This unsettled him. Although there remained a long road ahead, at least now General Michael Adams' story of what had transpired swiftly traveled from the police station into the larger community via whispers. Whispers had, he was not going alone, evolved into full-fledged dialogues with officers gathered in break rooms speaking in low whispers, some staring at Officer Davis's vacant desk. The air in the station was electric. Davis's suspension was more than simply a disciplinary punishment. It was a signal that things were changing. Sergeant Laura Smith stood in front of the assembled officers at the morning briefing session. Face was serious, her tone consistent. As many of you know, Officer Davis has been suspended pending an internal investigation. The event involving General Michael Adams violated our standards. We're here to safeguard and serve all members of our community. This means treating everyone with respect and fairness. A murmur passed through the room. Some officials nodded in agreement. Others seemed uncomfortable moving in their chairs, Smith saw. Although the varied responses of our activities show on the whole department, events like these destroy public confidence. We cannot afford to allow ourselves to be held to the lowest standards of excellence. We must therefore behave better. Officer Ramirez, a young guy, raised his hand and asked Sergeant what would happen to Davis Smith. His gaze would be decided upon by the investigation for now. He is suspended, but I want to be sure. Obvious, this is not just about Davis. It's about ensuring that everyone in this community recognizes the value of our involvement. Racial profiling has no place in our department. The audience grew hushed once again, the weight of Smith's remarks settling. We have to learn from this and make sure it doesn't happen once again. Over the cops, we will be holding extra training courses on racial sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. I anticipate complete participation. Smith watched them go, hoping her remarks had had an influence she knew wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. Officers trickled out of the room, some in deep contemplation, others muttering to their other. General Michael Adams had returned to his regular schedule, but his mind kept returning to the incident, not just about what occurred to him, but also about the wider consequences Michael had gotten a call about. From Smith, telling him about the inquiry and the actions being done to resolve the matter, he valued her efforts, but knew this was just the beginning. That afternoon, Michael got an invitation to meet with the Michael accepted, knowing the significance of these dialogues, so the meeting took place in a nearby town. Leaders of the community and police department representatives wanted to talk about what had transpired and how forward Michael should go. Center a big room, with chairs set in a circle. Michael came to see a mix of faces, police officials, community leaders, local activists, and a few citizens. Sergeant Smith was present. Along with Officer Ramirez and others from the department, Michael, some of the community leaders he had collaborated with over the years, were clearly visible as the conference started. The air was heavy with expectation. Mrs. Turner, an elderly lady with a kind but strict attitude, came up to speak to the gathering. Thank you everyone for attending. We are here today because of an occurrence that exposed problems we cannot anymore. Ignore General Adams. We value your eagerness to share your expertise and participate in this dialogue. Michael nodded, seeing everyone in the room staring at him. Then he inhaled before uttering, "What happened to me was incorrect." He stated straightforwardly, "But this is not just about me. It's about how we make sure everyone in our town feels protected, respected, and treated equally." Officer Collins was seated next to me. Smith said, "We want to improve. We are committed to make changes. But it will take time. What do you think we should concentrate on?" Michael appreciated the openness of the question. "Start with training," he replied. "Not just." Mrs. Turner agreed and said, "On racial sensitivity, but on how to engage the community. Officials need to understand that their role is to protect, not intimidate, and there needs to be clear consequences for those who cross the line." Mrs. Turner: "Right now, agreement trust is crucial. Particularly in minority populations, we must perceive that the police are on our side rather than against us." Sergeant Smith spoke next. "We are revising our policy on stops and searches. It is not just about punishment, but also about education and prevention. We want to establish a cooperation with the community. We quickly apply new training methods. Not create divide." A local activist called Jordan, who had been silently listening, raised his voice. "It's fantastic to hear that there is a commitment to change." And he added, "But we need openness. We need to know that when problems develop." Michael agreed that openness and responsibility are vital. This cannot just be about words. It is about actions people must see that changes. They are not hidden under the rug, are being created, wherein their perspectives are heard. The talk on several subjects proceeded, touching on community involvement programs, frequent interactions between police and citizens, and the need of cops being viewed as ideas rather than enforcers were discussed. Agreements were formed, and a cautious hope started to blossom as the conference came to finish. Sergeant Smith thanked Michael for being. Michael shook her hand. "Change isn't easy, but it's vital. Your opinion is priceless. We have a long way to go, but I think we can make a significant impact if we work with all of you to make sure everyone feels comfortable in a community." Smith nodded with a determined expression in her eyes. "We will do it together." As Michael left the community center, he felt optimism from the honest exchanges. Although there was still much to be done, Michael recognized that actual transformation would take time, patience, and a lot of work. He was eager to see it through for his neighborhood. And for everyone who thought in justice and equality, the road ahead was long. But for the first time in a while, Michael felt like they were moving in the right path. Now Officer James sensed the mood in the police station was different. Davis's suspension delivered a clear message, and the morning briefings, which seemed normal at first, had taken on a new gravity. Officers in professionalism, respect, and responsibility attended. Mandated racial sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Training courses that started awkward but required dialogues in one of these sessions. Officer Ramirez sat with his fellow police listening as an instructor from the community relations team discussed the need of acknowledging underlying prejudices Ramirez had been on for a few years and thought himself fair and just. Yet, as he listened, he realized he too had. Based on looks without even knowing it, the workshop urged officials to consider their actions and how they could affect others. After the training, Ramirez met up with Sergeant Laura Smith, pushing for real change in the department. He could see the will in her eyes, but also the tiredness. It wasn't easy altering a culture that had been ingrained in her. She had been arranging these sessions. Entrenched for years, Sergeant Ramirez started strolling with her during training sessions. I have heard other officers discussing things differently lately. I believe it's working. Smith looked at him. Beto replied, "We cannot simply expect things to change overnight. We have to start somewhere. Every conversation we have, every officer." A faint grin pulling at her lips. "Begins thinking differently. This is a positive approach." Ramirez nodded. "I have been considering what occurred with Davis and General Adams. Maybe not as clearly, but I have judged others before I even spoke with them. This training is helping me understand that." Smith put a hand on Ramirez's shoulder. "We've all made errors. The key thing is that we learn from them and do better. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. The fact that you're realizing we're headed ahead." As they kept walking, Smith couldn't help but feel hopeful. The event with General Michael Adams had rocked the department, but it had also raised significant awareness of self-reflection and a sincere desire to better. She realized there would still be opposition officials who felt nothing needed to change, but she also knew many were. Michael Adams was beginning to see why this mattered, as he was dealing with the knock-on consequences of his tragedy. Neighbors called and messaged, some offering support, while others apologized for not acting when. Michael welcomed the outreach, knowing that his story has opened many minds, not just within the police department. One day, Michael was requested to speak at a community forum arranged by. Michael agreed. Seeing the value of these dialogues, the community center wanted to promote between neighbors and law enforcement to restore trust and solve issues. It was crowded that evening. People filled the seats, and a handful of police, including Sergeant Smith and Officer Ramirez, waited at the rear. Michael mounted the platform, gazing out at the faces before him. There was a mix of. Michael started speaking, his voice steady. "Thanks everybody for coming here. Curiosity, concerns, and hope in the gathering. What happened to me was a painful experience, but one that has brought us together tonight. I want to start by saying that I believe in the power of community. I think that we can cooperate to build a safe, inclusive environment for everyone." He paused, allowing his words rest over the crowd, "but it means we have to. We have to face difficult facts and realize that prejudice and bias exist. Thus, safety goes beyond mere protection from crime to also guarantee that every person feels valued and appreciated." General Adams stated, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. I've seen it change, but I never thought something like this could happen here." An elderly guy in the front row raised his hand. Michael agreed, starting with awareness. He said, "Awareness of our own biases, awareness of how our actions affect others. The police department is implementing new training, but it's not about the cops. It's about all of us. We have to hold each other responsible if we come across anything that isn't right." Another hand went up this time. "This helps to create trust by action." Another young person got up. "Lady in the rear, what can we as residents help to be engaged?" Michael answered. "Attend these forums, have talks with your neighbors. Get to know the cops that patrol our streets. The more we engage, the stronger our community, because it's about developing connections and understanding." Sergeant Smith went up, joining Michael at the front. "General Adams is correct," she said. "We're determined to make changes within the department, but we need your help. We are your police force, and we want to serve you efficiently. We are here to listen, to learn, and to improve." The forum lasted for almost an hour, with citizens sharing their concerns, asking questions, and making solutions. Unlike the tension that had permeated the air after Michael's arrest, by the conclusion of the evening, the environment was open and courteous. There was a common resolve to going forward. As the audience started to spread, Michael found himself surrounded by neighbors, each want to shake his hand. Thank you for speaking out or sharing their own stories. He listened, providing words of support and understanding. He felt the power of community, the strength that comes from standing together. Sergeant Smith approached Michael as the room started to clear. That was powerful. She said, "You have made a genuine effect. People are listening." Michael smiled. "This is just the beginning, Sergeant. We had a chat. Now we must keep it continuing. Change takes time." Tonight was a positive move in the correct way. Smith nodded in agreement. "We will keep moving forward." Michael had a renewed feeling of purpose as he left the community center that evening. The events of the preceding days had been difficult, but they had also been changing the tides gradually, but definitely, Michael realized. Michael felt positive. He glanced up at the night sky stars blazing brilliantly above and made a note that there would be more work to do, more chats to have, but he was ready for it. Change was occurring, and firstly, in a long time. Though there was still a long road ahead, he had hoped that they were headed in the right direction. A few weeks had gone since the community forum, and a fresh awareness had descended over the police department. Respected prejudice and justice echoed throughout the police station's hallways and households' living rooms. There was a common knowledge that while progress had been achieved, the task was far from finished. Michael Adams started his regular walks, just as he had before the event. Except this time, things were different. The steps that had harbored distrust were now replaced by nods of thanks and pleasant-waved neighbors who had previously maintained their distance now approached him with grins ready to share a few words. Michael appreciated these little gestures. They were indicators that his message had been received, that change, however subtle, was taking root. One clear morning, Michael walked along the old tree-lined streets, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. He passed a bunch of children playing in their front yard, their laughter filling the air. A lady was out walking her dog. He nodded and smiled warmly as she passed Bohm. "Good morning, General Adams." She cried out morning, and Michael responded by tilting his head in reply as he continued his stroll. Michael spotted a police vehicle gently coming from the other way. For a while, his muscles stiffened, a response from the memories of his previous encounter, but as the vehicle drew nearer, he recognized Officer Ramirez behind the wheel. Ramirez pulled down his window and smiled. "Good morning." General Ramirez remarked, his tone kind. Michael returned the grin, feeling a sense of calm. "I'm fine." Officer Ramirez nodded. "Nice to hear. If you ever need anything, not hesitate." After all, Michael valued the gesture. "Thank you, officer. It's wonderful to see things go in the right path." Ramirez felt a rush of thanks. It wasn't only about the neighborhood, changes in policies, or the new training courses. Michael was about the change in attitude. People were ready to participate and learn. Michael resumed his stroll, passing more neighbors who welcomed him with pleasant nods and hell. Later that day, Michael had a meeting scheduled with Sergeant Laura Smith at the police station. She had asked him to address the continuous recurring issues, which once seemed like a place of judgment, now coming to feel like home. Improvements, and hear his opinions on their development. When Michael arrived at the station, he saw a distinct environment. Professionalism. Officers moved with focus. Some of them stopped to welcome. "General Adams thanks you for coming." Michael sat down, enjoying Smith's straightforward approach. As he walked in Smith's office, the sergeant rose to meet Michael, delivering a strong handshake. "General Adams." Highlight a quality Michael valued. "I wanted to let you know about the official dismissal of Officer Davis from the force. The inquiry found his conduct violated department standards." His dismissal wasn't just about punishment. It was about creating a standard for what we expect from our officers. Michael nodded. "I believe it was the appropriate choice. Davis's behavior was improper, and his acts betrayed the confidence between the police and the community." Smith sighed, looking carefully. "It's not an easy thing letting someone go, but we need officers who are devoted to justice and fairness. We have adopted new training courses on de-escalation and cultural understanding, now mandate attendance by community engagement officers. We also plan frequent community events." Michael was happy to hear this. These are crucial actions, Sergeant. I have seen already the way the cops are dealing with the community. Open lines of communication are vital. Altered people feel heard." Smith grinned. "We have had good comments. The community feels more linked, more ready to interact with us. It's great to see how a little modification might make such an—" Michael leaned forward, his voice with a serious attitude. "Nevertheless, we cannot stop here. We must keep this momentum running as culture shapes attitude more than simply regulations and training." Smith nodded. "I agree, we have made progress, but there is a need for a culture of respect, wherein every officer realizes their mission is to protect and serve everyone without prejudice. Have more to accomplish. I am dedicated to see this through, and know others are too." Michael stepped up, offering his hand once. "More thanks for your leadership and for considering this seriously. Change is not easy, but together we can make a difference." Smith grasped his hand firmly. "Thanks, General Adams. Your bravery and public speech have been a—" Remember that Michael experienced closure the event as he exited the station, therefore acting as a trigger for these developments. It was a reminder that had begun with mistrust, and anger had resulted in important conversation and actual progress. Even challenging circumstances might provide chances for development. Michael was pleased with the actions they had done. However, he understood that the battle for justice and equality needed ongoing work and dedication, and that vigilance was fundamental.